They say that blood is thicker than water, but I learned that greed is thicker than both. I watched my stepson dismantle everything his father built, everything we built together, piece by piece, dollar by dollar, lie by lie. And the most devastating part is that I let him do it. I stood there with my eyes wide open as he stripped away the house, the investments, the properties, even the dignity of his father's memory. People thought I was weak. They thought I was a grieving widow too broken to fight back. They thought Derek had outsmarted me, that he had finally gotten everything he always believed he deserved. What none of them knew, what Derek himself never suspected until it was far too late, was that every single thing he took was something I placed directly into his hands. Every document he forged, every account he drained, every lie he told, I was watching. I was waiting, and I was building a case so airtight that when the walls finally closed in around him, there would be no escape, no excuse, and no one left to believe a single word that came out of his mouth. My name is Rachel, and this is the story of how my stepson betrayed me, how he destroyed his own family, and how I made absolutely certain that he faced every consequence he so desperately tried to avoid. I met Martin Lawson when I was 43 years old, at a charity gala in Boston that I almost didn't attend. I had built my own marketing firm from nothing, working 18-hour days for nearly 2 decades, and I was finally at a place in my life where I could breathe. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't looking for anything except a glass of champagne and an excuse to wear the dress I had bought on a whim 6 months earlier. But Martin walked up to me at the silent auction table, pointed at a painting of a lighthouse that I had been pretending to consider, and said, "That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen, and I've been staring at it for 20 minutes trying to figure out why anyone would bid on it." I laughed so hard that champagne nearly came out of my nose, and from that moment forward, something shifted in my universe. Martin was a widower. His first wife, Caroline, had passed away from ovarian cancer when Derek was only 12 years old. Martin had raised his son alone for the next 8 years, pouring everything he had into giving Derek stability, opportunity, and love. By the time I met Martin, Derek was 20 years old and already showing signs of the person he would eventually become. He was charming on the surface, the kind of young man who knew exactly what to say to make you feel special. But there was something underneath that charm, something cold and calculating that I noticed almost immediately. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that I was just nervous about becoming a stepmother to a grown man who had every reason to resent me. I told myself that Derek's occasional cruel comments and dismissive behavior were just the growing pains of a young adult adjusting to change. I was so desperately wrong. Martin and I dated for 2 years before he proposed. During that time, Derek was mostly absent from our lives. He was attending business school in New York, funded entirely by his father, and he rarely came home for holidays or family events. When he did visit, he was polite but distant, treating me like a temporary fixture in his father's life, rather than someone who might actually matter. I tried to connect with him. I really did. I invited him to dinners, sent him birthday gifts, asked Martin endless questions about his interests and hobbies so that I could find common ground. But Derek had no interest in finding common ground with me. To him, I was an obstacle, a complication, someone standing between him and the inheritance he had already spent years mentally calculating. Martin and I married in a small ceremony on Cape Cod, surrounded by close friends and the handful of family members we had left. Derek attended, though he spent most of the reception on his phone, and when he gave his toast, it was so generic that it could have been written by a stranger. Martin noticed. I know he did. But he made excuses for his son the way he always made excuses. "He's just not good with emotions," Martin would say. "He loved his mother so much, and I think he feels guilty for connecting with anyone else." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that underneath Derek's cold exterior was a wounded boy who just needed time and patience. So I gave him time. I gave him patience. And I gave him the benefit of every single doubt, even when the evidence started piling up, that Derek was not a wounded boy at all. He was something far more dangerous. The first real warning sign came 3 years into my marriage, when Martin suffered a mild heart attack. He was 56 at the time, and the incident scared us both into making serious changes. Martin cut back his hours at the real estate development company he had founded, started exercising, changed his diet, and began the process of planning for retirement. Part of that planning involved updating his estate documents, and that was when Derek suddenly became very interested in our lives again. He started calling every week. He started visiting on weekends. He started asking questions about the business, the investments, the properties, the bank accounts. Martin was thrilled by this sudden attention. He believed his brush with mortality had finally woken Derek up, finally made him appreciate family and connection and the things that really mattered. But I saw something different in Derek's eyes. I saw calculation. I saw hunger. And I saw a young man who was carefully positioning himself to take everything the moment his father was no longer around to protect it. I tried to talk to Martin about my concerns, but he refused to hear it. The one time I brought up my observations, Martin looked at me with such hurt in his eyes that I immediately backed down. "Derek is my son," he said quietly. "He's made mistakes, yes, but he's trying to change. I need you to give him a chance." So I did. I gave Derek chance after chance, even as he continued to treat me like an inconvenience, even as he whispered things to Martin that created distance between us, even as he slowly but surely began to turn my husband against the very woman who loved him most. Martin passed away 4 years later, on a cold February morning, in the bed we had shared for nearly a decade. His heart, which had been weak since that first attack, finally gave out during the night. I woke up to find him cold and still beside me, and the grief that hit me was so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe for what felt like hours. I lost the love of my life that morning. I lost my partner, my best friend, the person who had made me believe in second chances. And in the days that followed, as I tried to navigate the impossible terrain of sudden widowhood, I also began to lose everything else. Derek arrived 3 days after his father's death, and from the moment he walked through the door, I knew something had shifted. Gone was the pretense of politeness, the mask of civility. In its place was a cold determination that sent chills down my spine. Derek didn't hug me when he arrived. He didn't offer condolences or ask how I was holding up. He walked past me into the house that had been his childhood home, looked around as if he was appraising it, and then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We need to talk about the estate," he said. Martin's will was supposed to be straightforward. He and I had discussed it extensively, and he had made his wishes very clear. The house would go to me, along with the majority of his liquid assets and investment accounts. Derek would receive a substantial inheritance, approximately $2 million in cash and securities, along with a rental property in Connecticut that generated significant passive income. Martin had also set up a trust for any future grandchildren, funded with an additional $1 million. It was generous, thoughtful, and designed to ensure that everyone was taken care of. But Derek had other ideas. The reading of the will took place at Evelyn Cross's office 1 week after the funeral. Evelyn had been Martin's attorney and close friend for over 30 years, and she was one of the few people who knew exactly what Martin wanted. When she read the terms of the will aloud, I watched Derek's face transform from expectant confidence to barely concealed rage. He had expected everything. He had expected the house, the business, the accounts, all of it. In his mind, he was the rightful heir, the blood son, the continuation of the Lawson legacy. And I was just the woman his father had married late in life, someone who didn't deserve a single cent of what Martin had built. "This isn't right," Derek said, his voice low and dangerous. "There must be some mistake." Evelyn looked at him with the calm patience of someone who had dealt with entitled heirs her entire career. "There's no mistake, Derek. This is exactly what your father wanted. He was very clear about his intentions." Derek turned to look at me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that I will never forget. It was hatred, pure and absolute. The kind of hatred that doesn't come from a single moment, but from years of festering resentment. He blamed me. He blamed me for coming into his father's life, for taking attention and resources that he believed should have been his alone, for existing in a space that he considered his birthright. And in that look, I saw exactly what was coming. "We'll see about that," Derek said quietly, and then he walked out of the office without another word. The attacks began almost immediately. Derek contested the will, claiming that his father had been unduly influenced by me in his final years, that I had manipulated a sick and vulnerable man into leaving me the majority of his estate. The accusation was absurd, of course. Martin had been sharp and competent until the very end, and there were dozens of people who could testify to his mental clarity. But the legal challenge tied up the estate in probate, freezing all the assets and leaving me in limbo while Derek plotted his next move. During this time, I discovered that Derek had been busy during his father's final months. He had convinced Martin to add him as a signatory on several bank accounts, claiming that he needed access to help manage business affairs. He had persuaded Martin to sign a power of attorney that gave Derek broad authority over financial matters, a document that Martin apparently believed was limited and specific, but was actually written to give Derek almost unlimited control. And he had been slowly transferring small amounts from various accounts into his own name, amounts that seemed insignificant individually, but added up to nearly $100,000 by the time I started investigating. When I confronted Derek about these transfers, he laughed in my face. "You can't prove anything," he said. "Dad gave me permission for all of it. And even if you could prove something, who do you think a judge is going to believe? The devoted son who spent his whole life trying to live up to his father's expectations? Or the gold digger who showed up at the last minute and convinced a lonely old man to marry her?" I should have been devastated by those words. I should have been enraged. But instead, I felt something else entirely. I felt a cold, clear certainty settle into my bones. Derek had underestimated me. He saw a grieving widow, someone weakened by loss and overwhelmed by legal complexity. He saw an easy target, someone he could bully and manipulate into submission. What he didn't see was the woman who had built a company from nothing, who had survived a decade in one of the most cutthroat industries in the country, who had faced down predatory competitors and hostile takeovers, and every kind of business betrayal imaginable. Derek thought he was dealing with a soft, vulnerable woman who would crumble at the first sign of conflict. He had no idea who he was really dealing with. I made a decision in that moment, standing in the kitchen of the house that Martin and I had shared, looking at the smug face of the man who was trying to steal everything. I decided that I was going to let Derek win. I was going to let him take everything he wanted, everything he thought he deserved. I was going to step back, appear defeated, give him every opportunity to show exactly who he really was. And then, when he had finally revealed the full extent of his betrayal, when he had committed acts so undeniable that no court in the country could ignore them, I was going to destroy him. The first step in my plan was to appear weak. I withdrew the contest to Derek's probate challenge, citing emotional exhaustion and a desire to settle matters peacefully. I agreed to a mediation that Derek's attorney had proposed, and I accepted terms that were significantly less favorable than what Martin's will had actually specified. I gave up the house. I gave up half of the investment accounts. I gave up the rental property in Connecticut. I watched Derek's eyes light up with greedy triumph as each concession was made, and I kept my face carefully neutral, playing the role of a beaten woman who just wanted the nightmare to end. What Derek didn't know was that I had Evelyn working behind the scenes, documenting every single irregularity in the estate. What he didn't know was that I had hired a private investigator, a former FBI forensic accountant named Marcus Chen, who was quietly tracing every transaction Derek had made in the past 5 years. What he didn't know was that I had copies of every document, every email, every text message that Martin had ever received from or sent to his son, preserved and protected in a secure location that Derek would never find. I was building a case, piece by piece, fact by fact, and Derek was so blinded by his own arrogance that he didn't see any of it coming. The mediation concluded 6 months after Martin's death, and Derek walked away believing he had won. He took possession of the house immediately, moving in with his girlfriend, a woman named Vanessa, who was just as calculating as he was. He liquidated the Connecticut property within weeks, pocketing the sale proceeds, without even attempting to follow the terms of the settlement that required him to split them with the estate. He accessed the investment accounts and began transferring funds to offshore entities that Marcus was tracking with growing concern. And he started to dismantle Martin's business, selling off assets and contracts to competitors who were all too happy to pick apart the company that Martin had spent 30 years building. I watched all of this happen. I watched Derek systematically destroy his father's legacy, and I said nothing. I let people think I was weak, broken, defeated. I stopped attending social functions where Derek might be present. I moved into a small apartment in Cambridge, downsizing dramatically from the lifestyle I had shared with Martin. I let Derek believe that he had crushed me, that his campaign of intimidation and theft had worked exactly as he planned. And all the while, Marcus was documenting everything. The breakthrough came 8 months after the mediation, when Marcus discovered something that changed everything. Derek hadn't just been stealing from the estate. He had been stealing from his father while Martin was still alive. The transfers I had discovered were just the tip of the iceberg. Over the course of Martin's final 3 years, Derek had embezzled nearly $700,000 from the business, using his position as a minority shareholder and his father's trusting nature to siphon funds into shell companies he controlled. He had forged Martin's signature on dozens of documents, including loan applications that had leveraged the family properties as collateral. And most damning of all, he had taken out a life insurance policy on his father without Martin's knowledge, listing himself as the sole beneficiary. The policy was worth $2 million, and Derek had collected the payout less than a month after Martin's death. When Marcus presented me with this evidence, I felt something I hadn't felt since Martin died. I felt alive. Not with happiness, not with joy, but with the fierce, burning certainty that justice was finally within reach. Derek had committed serious crimes, crimes that went far beyond a simple inheritance dispute. He had committed fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and potentially insurance fraud. And I had documentation of all of it. But I didn't go to the authorities immediately. That would have been too easy, too quick, too clean. Derek deserved more than a simple arrest and prosecution. He deserved to lose everything the way he had tried to make me lose everything. He deserved to watch his world crumble around him, to feel the walls closing in, to experience the same helpless desperation he had inflicted on me during those terrible months after Martin's death. So I waited. I continued to play the role of the defeated widow, and I set the final pieces of my plan into motion. The first target was Vanessa. Derek's girlfriend was not an innocent bystander in any of this. She had actively participated in the fraud, signing documents as a witness when she knew the signatures were forged, helping Derek establish the shell companies, and spending the stolen money with abandon. But Vanessa was also ambitious, and I suspected that her loyalty to Derek extended only as far as his usefulness to her. I needed to test that suspicion, and I knew exactly how to do it. I arranged a meeting with Vanessa through a mutual acquaintance, presenting it as an opportunity for reconciliation. Vanessa agreed, probably because she saw it as a chance to gloat, and we met at a quiet cafe in Boston on a rainy afternoon. She was exactly as I remembered, beautiful and cold, with eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. I played my part perfectly, appearing defeated and conciliatory, expressing a desire to put the past behind us for the sake of Martin's memory. And then I dropped the first piece of information. "I've been meaning to tell you," I said casually, "that I finally sorted through all of Martin's old files. He kept meticulous records, as I'm sure you know. It was quite an education, seeing exactly where all the money went over the years." Vanessa's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear. She knew exactly what I was implying, and she was trying to calculate how much I actually knew. "I'm sure that must have been difficult for you," she said carefully. "It was illuminating," I replied. For instance, I had no idea that Derek had established so many business entities in the past few years, some of them quite creative, actually. Though I imagine the IRS might have questions about a few of the arrangements. The fear in Vanessa's eyes deepened, but she maintained her composure. "I don't know anything about Derek's business affairs," she said. "That's not my area." "Of course not," I agreed. "I wouldn't expect you to know the details. But I should warn you, as someone who has been through a difficult situation myself, that when things start to unravel, they tend to unravel completely. And in my experience, the person holding the bag is usually the person who didn't see it coming." I left the cafe without another word, letting the implications hang in the air. I knew that Vanessa would go straight to Derek with everything I had said, and I knew that Derek would respond in one of two ways. Either he would panic and start making mistakes, or he would become more aggressive in his attempts to silence me. Either outcome would serve my purposes. As it turned out, Derek chose aggression. 2 weeks after my meeting with Vanessa, I received a letter from an attorney I had never heard of, threatening legal action if I continued to spread defamatory statements about Derek Lawson. The letter was vague and toothless, clearly designed to intimidate rather than to actually pursue litigation, but it told me exactly what I needed to know. Derek was scared. He knew that I had information that could hurt him, and he was trying to silence me before I could use it, but Derek's fear made him reckless. In the weeks that followed, he made a series of decisions that would ultimately seal his fate. He accelerated the liquidation of Martin's business assets, selling properties and contracts at below-market prices to generate quick cash. He transferred large sums to the offshore accounts that Marcus was tracking, moving money in patterns that were clearly designed to hide its origin. And he made the fatal mistake of approaching Martin's former business partners with a proposal that would come back to haunt him. Martin's company had been involved in several major development projects at the time of his death, projects that were still ongoing and generating significant revenue. Derek, as the new majority owner after the mediation settlement, had the authority to make decisions about these projects. But instead of continuing the work his father had started, Derek decided to sabotage it. He entered into secret agreements with competing developers, essentially selling inside information about the projects in exchange for kickbacks. He inflated costs on contracts he controlled, pocketing the difference. And he lied to the investors and partners who had trusted Martin, telling them that delays and cost overruns were unavoidable, when in fact they were deliberately manufactured. One of those partners was a man named Richard Donovan, who had been Martin's friend and business associate for over 20 years. Richard had attended Martin's funeral, had expressed his condolences to me personally, and had been increasingly troubled by the direction the company was taking under Derek's leadership. When Richard started asking questions, Derek made another critical mistake. He tried to threaten Richard into silence, suggesting that Richard's own involvement in the projects might not survive close scrutiny. But Richard had nothing to hide, and Derek's threats only convinced him that something was seriously wrong. Richard reached out to me through Evelyn, asking if we could meet. I agreed immediately, and what he told me over the course of a 3-hour dinner confirmed everything I had suspected and more. Richard had documentation of Derek's sabotage, records of the suspicious agreements and inflated contracts. He had been quietly gathering evidence for months, unsure of what to do with it, afraid of the legal and financial consequences of going public. When I told him about the evidence I had gathered, about Marcus's investigation and the full scope of Derek's fraud, Richard's face went pale. "My God," he said quietly. "Martin would be devastated. He loved that boy more than anything." "I know," I replied. "That's what makes this so hard. Martin would want me to protect Derek, to give him another chance. But Derek has gone too far. He's not just stealing money, he's destroying everything Martin built, and he's hurting people who trusted his father." Richard agreed to cooperate fully with my investigation. He turned over all the documents he had gathered, provided statements about Derek's behavior, and agreed to testify if necessary. With his help, the case against Derek became overwhelming. We now had evidence of fraud, embezzlement, forgery, insurance fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to defraud investors. Derek had committed crimes at every level, from petty theft to securities fraud, and there was no way he could explain away the mountain of evidence we had compiled. But I still wasn't ready to move. There was one more piece of the puzzle I needed. One more betrayal that I wanted to expose before I brought everything crashing down. I needed to prove that Derek had been working against his father long before Martin died, that his supposed devotion during those final years was nothing but a calculated act designed to position himself for the inheritance. I needed to show the world who Derek really was. The answer came from an unexpected source. Vanessa, apparently reconsidering her loyalties after our conversation at the cafe, reached out to me 3 months after our meeting. She wanted to talk, she said. She had information that she thought I should know. I was suspicious, of course, but I agreed to meet her, this time at Evelyn's office with witnesses present. What Vanessa told me that afternoon was worse than anything I had imagined. She revealed that Derek's attention to his father during those final years had been part of a deliberate plan, a strategy he had developed long before Martin's heart attack. Derek had been monitoring Martin's health through conversations with his doctors, exploiting the trust that came with being the only son of a widower. He had known about Martin's heart condition before Martin himself knew, and he had used that knowledge to begin positioning himself for the inheritance. But that wasn't the worst of it. Vanessa revealed that Derek had actively worked to isolate Martin from potential support systems, including me. He had planted seeds of doubt about my motives, suggesting to Martin that I was only interested in his money, that I was manipulating him, that I couldn't be trusted. Many of the arguments Martin and I had during our marriage, arguments that had seemed to come from nowhere, had actually been triggered by things Derek had said. He had been driving wedges between us for years, weakening our relationship so that when the time came, Martin might be more inclined to side with his son. And then, Vanessa told me the thing that made my blood run cold. She told me that Derek had discussed, on more than one occasion, ways to speed up the inevitable. He had never explicitly said he wanted to hurt his father, but he had researched heart conditions, had asked questions about what might trigger another attack, had wondered aloud whether certain medications might have adverse interactions. Vanessa didn't know if Derek had ever acted on any of this research. She didn't know if Martin's final heart attack had been entirely natural. But the fact that Derek had even considered such things was horrifying beyond words. I asked Vanessa why she was telling me all of this, why she was betraying the man she had been living with for over a year. Her answer was simple and brutally honest. Because I finally realized that I'm disposable to him, she said. He's been moving money into accounts I can't access. He's been meeting with other women. And last week, I heard him on the phone with his lawyer, asking about how to protect assets from a domestic partner if a relationship ends. He's planning to leave me with nothing, just like he planned to leave you with nothing. And I refuse to be his next victim. Vanessa agreed to provide a sworn statement about everything she knew. She agreed to turn over documents, recordings, and other evidence that she had gathered during her time with Derek, and she agreed to testify against him if the case went to trial. In exchange, I promised to advocate for leniency if she faced any charges related to her participation in Derek's schemes. It was a practical arrangement, not a friendship, but it gave me the final pieces I needed. With Vanessa's evidence, the case against Derek was complete. I had documentation of every crime he had committed, testimony from multiple witnesses, and a clear timeline showing how he had systematically betrayed his father and stolen from the estate. I had enough evidence to send him to prison for years, to destroy his reputation, to ensure that he never hurt anyone else the way he had hurt me and Martin. But before I went to the authorities, I wanted Derek to know exactly who had defeated him. I wanted him to look me in the eye and understand that everything he thought he had won was about to be taken away. I arranged a final meeting with Derek at the house that had once been my home, the house he had stolen from me through intimidation and fraud. He agreed to meet, probably because he believed I was coming to beg for some small concession, some pathetic attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of my life. When I arrived, he was waiting in the living room, sitting in Martin's favorite chair like a king on his throne. Rachel, he said with that cold smile I had come to hate. What a surprise. I didn't think you'd ever have the nerve to come back here. I wanted to see you one more time, I replied, keeping my voice calm and steady. Before everything changes. Something flickered in Derek's eyes. Suspicion, maybe. The beginning of fear. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. It means that I know everything, Derek. I know about the embezzlement from your father's company. I know about the forged documents. I know about the life insurance policy. I know about the sabotage development projects and the kickbacks from competitors. I know about the offshore accounts and the shell companies. I know about the threats you made to Richard Donovan. And I know about the things Vanessa told me, the things you did to isolate your father, the things you researched about heart conditions and medications. Derek's face went white. For the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, schooling his features into a mask of contempt. You can't prove any of that, he said. And even if you could, who would believe you? You're just a bitter, vindictive woman who couldn't accept that she lost. I smiled then, and I saw the fear return to Derek's eyes when he realized that my smile was not the smile of someone who was bluffing. I have proof of all of it, I said. Documents, records, testimony from witnesses, forensic analysis of financial transactions. I have enough evidence to send you to prison for a very long time. And I have something else, too. I have a meeting scheduled tomorrow morning with the district attorney's office, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, and the State Insurance Fraud Bureau. By this time tomorrow, Derek, your life as you know it will be over. Derek stood up, his hands clenched into fists, his face twisted with rage. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to hurt me, but I wasn't afraid. I had brought witnesses. I had prepared for this moment, and I knew that any attempt at violence would only add to the charges against him. You can't do this, he hissed. I'm Martin's son. I'm his blood. You have no right to destroy me. I'm not destroying you, Derek, I replied. You destroyed yourself. You made every choice. You committed every crime. You betrayed every person who ever trusted you, including the father who loved you more than anything in the world. I'm simply making sure that there are consequences for what you've done. I turned and walked out of the house, leaving Derek standing alone in the living room where his father had taken his last breath. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew that the next time I saw Derek Lawson, it would be across a courtroom. The investigation moved quickly once I turned over the evidence. The FBI was particularly interested in the financial fraud and the offshore accounts, which turned out to be connected to a larger network of money laundering operations. The insurance company launched its own investigation into the life insurance policy, and preliminary findings suggested that Derek had provided false information on the application. And the district attorney's office convened a grand jury to consider charges related to the embezzlement, forgery, and fraud against the estate. Derek was arrested 6 weeks after our final meeting, taken into custody at the house that he had stolen from me. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and conspiracy, along with insurance fraud and wire fraud related to the interstate movement of stolen funds. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 40 years in federal prison. The trial took place 18 months later, after countless motions and delays and desperate attempts by Derek's attorneys to suppress the evidence. But the evidence was too overwhelming, too thoroughly documented, too meticulously prepared. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about Derek's crimes. Richard Donovan described the sabotage of the development projects. Marcus Chen walked the jury through the forensic analysis of the financial transactions. Evelyn Cross explained the will and the estate, the terms that Martin had wanted, and the ways that Derek had violated them. And Vanessa, in perhaps the most damaging testimony of all, described Derek's years-long campaign to defraud his father and isolate him from everyone who might have protected him. Derek took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony only made things worse. He was arrogant, dismissive, and contemptuous, treating the jurors like obstacles rather than people whose opinions mattered. He denied everything, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by a vindictive stepmother who had always hated him. But the evidence was simply too strong. The jury saw the documents. They heard the testimony. They understood exactly who Derek Lawson really was. The verdict came after only 6 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Derek sat motionless as the foreman read the verdict, his face a mask of disbelief. I sat in the gallery and watched, feeling not triumph but a profound and overwhelming sadness. This was not the outcome Martin would have wanted. This was not the legacy he had dreamed of leaving. But it was the consequence of choices that Derek had made, choices that no one had forced him to make, choices that had destroyed his own future as surely as they had destroyed everything else. The sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, a stern woman who had presided over the trial with fairness and efficiency, addressed Derek directly before announcing the sentence. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "you have shown a pattern of behavior that is deeply troubling. You betrayed your father's trust. You stole from his estate. You defrauded his business partners. You committed crimes that were not impulsive or desperate, but calculated and sustained over many years. And perhaps most disturbingly, you have shown no remorse for any of it. Throughout this trial, you have blamed others for your actions, denied responsibility for your choices, and refused to acknowledge the harm you have caused. I have considered all of the arguments presented by your counsel, and I have given significant thought to the appropriate sentence for someone in your situation." She paused, looking down at the papers in front of her, and then back up at Derek. "I hereby sentence you to 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 12 years. Additionally, I am ordering full restitution to all affected parties, including the estate of Martin Lawson, the defrauded investors, and the insurance company. Any assets you possess will be seized and liquidated to satisfy these obligations." Derek finally showed emotion then. He turned pale, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table, his mouth opening and closing as if he couldn't find words. 22 years. By the time he was eligible for parole, he would be middle-aged. By the time he completed his sentence, he would be 50. The future he had schemed and stolen and betrayed for was gone, replaced by the inside of a prison cell. I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon and stood on the steps, breathing in the cool autumn air. Evelyn joined me a moment later, putting a hand on my shoulder in silent support. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. How did I feel? I felt tired. I felt relieved. I felt sad. I felt vindicated. I felt all of these things, and none of them. A complicated mixture of emotions that would take months or years to fully process. "I feel like it's finally over," I said eventually. "I feel like Martin can finally rest." In the months that followed, I worked with Evelyn and Marcus to recover what could be recovered from the wreckage of Derek's fraud. Some of the offshore money was traced and reclaimed. Some of the assets that Derek had liquidated were recovered through negotiations with the buyers, who were sometimes willing to return them rather than face their own legal complications. The house was eventually returned to the estate, and I sold it shortly afterward, unable to imagine living in a place that held so many painful memories. The money I recovered went primarily to the defrauded investors, to people who had trusted Martin and been hurt by his son's betrayal. I kept only what I needed to live comfortably, and I established a foundation in Martin's name to support the causes he had believed in. It wasn't the legacy he had planned, but it was something. It was a way of ensuring that his memory would be associated with generosity and integrity rather than the crimes of his son. I think about Derek sometimes, alone in his cell, living with the consequences of choices he can never take back. I wonder if he understands now what he lost. Not just the money and the freedom, but the relationships, the family, the love that he could have had if he had just chosen differently. I wonder if he ever thinks about his father, about the man who loved him unconditionally and whom he betrayed so completely. I hope that he does. I hope that the weight of what he has done sits heavily on his conscience, that he spends his years in prison understanding exactly why he is there. But I also know that people like Derek rarely change. They rarely accept responsibility for their actions. They rarely feel genuine remorse for the harm they have caused. Derek will probably spend the rest of his life believing that he was the victim, that I somehow orchestrated his downfall, that the consequences he faces are unfair and undeserved. He will tell himself whatever story he needs to tell to avoid confronting the truth of who he is. And that's fine. That's his burden to carry, not mine. I have found peace in the years since the trial. Not happiness exactly, not the joy I felt during my marriage to Martin, but something close to it. A sense of purpose, a sense of closure, a sense that I did what needed to be done, not out of hatred or revenge, but out of a commitment to justice and to the memory of the man I loved. Martin deserved better than a son who would betray him. Martin deserved better than to have his legacy destroyed by greed and selfishness. And by fighting for the truth, by ensuring that Derek faced the consequences of his actions, I gave Martin the only gift I could still give him. I gave him justice. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine what Martin would say if he could see everything that happened. I imagine him standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his voice quiet and warm. And in my imagination, he always says the same thing. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting for what was right. And thank you for loving me enough to see it through. I carry those imagined words with me every day. They are a comfort when the memories become too painful. They are a reminder of why I did what I did. And they are a promise that I will spend the rest of my life honoring the man who loved me, who trusted me, and who deserved so much better than the betrayal he received from his own blood. My stepson took everything from me. He took my home, my inheritance, my peace of mind. He took the final years of my husband's life, poisoning them with manipulation and deceit. He took my faith in family, my belief that blood relationships mean something sacred and unbreakable. He took everything he could take, everything he thought he was entitled to, everything he believed he deserved. And in the end, I let him take it all. I let him believe he had won. I let him become comfortable in his stolen kingdom, confident in his apparent victory. I gave him rope, as the old saying goes, and I watched as he used every inch of it to hang himself. Because that's the thing about people like Derek. They are so convinced of their own superiority, so certain that they are smarter than everyone around them, that they never see the trap closing until it's too late. They take and take and take, never imagining that anyone could be patient enough, determined enough, or clever enough to stop them. They believe their lies so completely that they forget other people might see through them. And when they finally face the consequences of their actions, they are always surprised. Derek was surprised when the FBI showed up at his door. He was surprised when the evidence was presented at trial. He was surprised when the jury returned a guilty verdict. And he was surprised when the judge handed down a sentence that would take away the best years of his life. He spent so many years believing he was untouchable that he never prepared for the possibility that he might be wrong. I learned something important from this experience, something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I learned that the best revenge is not quick or violent or dramatic. The best revenge is patient. The best revenge is systematic. The best revenge is allowing your enemy to believe they have won, while you quietly, carefully, methodically build the case that will destroy them. The best revenge is letting someone dig their own grave, and then handing them the shovel. Derek dug his grave for years, and when it was finally deep enough, I made sure he couldn't climb out. I don't regret any of it. Not the waiting, not the planning, not the seemingly endless months of appearing defeated while I gathered evidence. I don't regret the confrontation at the house, or the trial, or the sentence that followed. I don't even regret the moments of doubt, the nights when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, the fears that Derek might somehow escape justice. Those doubts were human. Those fears were natural. And overcoming them made the eventual victory all the sweeter. The only thing I regret is that Martin never got to see the truth about his son. The only thing I regret is that Martin died still believing in Derek, still hoping that his boy would eventually become the man he had raised him to be. Martin loved his son completely and unconditionally, and Derek used that love as a weapon against him. That is Derek's greatest crime in my eyes. Not the money he stole, not the lies he told, but the betrayal of a father's love. That is unforgivable. That is what keeps me up at night sometimes. The knowledge that Martin died without knowing the truth about the person he loved most in the world. But I like to think that wherever Martin is now, he knows. I like to think that he saw the trial, the evidence, the verdict, the sentence. I like to think that he understood, finally, what Derek really was, and what I did to stop him. And I like to think that he is proud of me, proud of the woman he married, proud of the fight I fought on his behalf. That thought is enough. That thought is more than enough. My stepson took everything from me, and I let him. I let him because I knew that taking everything would require him to commit crimes, would require him to leave a trail of evidence, would require him to become so comfortable in his arrogance that he would never see the consequences coming. I let him because I knew that patience was the only weapon I needed, that time would reveal the truth, that justice would eventually prevail. And now Derek sits in a prison cell, stripped of everything he stole, abandoned by everyone he used, facing decades of confinement for crimes he was too proud to believe he could ever be caught committing. And I sit here, at peace, knowing that I did what Martin would have wanted me to do. Not out of revenge, not out of hatred, but out of love. Out of a commitment to the man who gave me a second chance at happiness. Out of a determination to protect his memory and his legacy from the son who tried to destroy both. This is my story. This is the truth of what happened, and this is my promise to Martin, and to myself, that I will never let anyone take from me again without facing the full weight of the consequences. Justice may be slow. Justice may be difficult. Justice may require more patience and determination than any person should have to give. But justice is real. Justice is possible. And justice is worth fighting for. Derek learned that lesson too late. But I hope that whoever hears this story learns it before they have to learn it the hard way. Betrayal has consequences. Greed has consequences. And underestimating the people you hurt most has the greatest consequences of all. I am Rachel Morrison. I was a wife, a stepmother, and a victim. I am now a survivor, a victor, and a woman who knows exactly what she is capable of when pushed to her limits. And my stepson, who thought he could take everything from me, discovered the truth the hard way. Some things are more powerful than blood. Some bonds are stronger than family. And some women, when betrayed, become forces of nature that cannot be stopped. I am one of those women. And this is the end of my story.